Joined by Senator Tom Cotton. For those of you living in caves, Senator Cotton is from Arkansas, represents Arkansas now in his seventh year, second term. Before that, he was a member of the House. Before that, he's a member of the 101st Airborne, a member of the Old Guard. He has his Ranger tab. He's familiar with weapons of war. He served in combat. He is the father of small children. Good morning, Senator. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. I'm good. It's good to be back on with you.
Senator Cornyn has been appointed by Leader McConnell as the sort of Republican who will negotiate with Democrats over what, if anything, to do in the aftermath of Uvalde and Buffalo. Will you be participating in those talks directly or indirectly, and what's your initial thought on that process?
Well, Hugh, I will monitor what Senator Cornyn and others are doing. Of course, it's hard to evaluate it before the fact. And in Uvalde in particular, we are still gathering the facts to figure out exactly what happened. And I think it's important that we have those facts before we try to devise solutions to situations that may or may not have occurred. So, for instance, obviously, we thought that early last week that there was a school resource officer present and that the police went in and immediately disarmed the shooter. We now know that not to be the case. So we need to get to all the facts first before we make a decision about how to address this latest mass murder. I will say that I don't think any of these terrible atrocities have a single or a simple cause behind them, and therefore I think any call for a single or simple solution will probably fail. That it requires a careful and layered approach that addresses not just school safety, but also, the willingness of teachers and coaches and parents and others to identify troubled young boys, because these shootings are always young boys, and they're almost always troubled young boys, early, to try to help identify who may be at risk of having this kind of mental break and getting them the help they need in advance. We can also work on school safety in terms of ingress and egress points or the presence of school resource officers. But again, I don't think a single solution is going to work. I don't think there's a single cause for these mass murders.
Senator, I had a caller earlier who I agreed with because, of course, it was the position I hold, which is I do not understand why there are not armed police on school grounds when school children, especially defenseless school children at the age of, primary grades, are present. And the resource officer in Texas wasn't there. Resource officer is a misnomer. I used armed police. And in the 4 occasions where they have been there, that Matt Vespa has written up, they effectively stopped would-be killers in parking lots because they were good and responded well. It's expensive, though. I mean, there are 131,000 K through 12 public and private schools, and it's expensive to put officers there. I've had officers call the show and say, we don't want rookies and you don't want retirees. You want officers about 5 years into their tenure to do 2 years on campuses. What do you think of that general observation that generally you stop monsters with guns by armed police who are trained?
Well, Hugh, I think that's generally correct. In general, the more police, the less crime. That's true at schools as well. As I said, we need to figure out exactly what happened at the elementary school in Uvalde with their police officer and why he wasn't present and why he wasn't able to neutralize that shooter from the very beginning. But in general, any place is going to be safer if it has police presence. And I think you're right, too, about the police that you want at a school. You want it to be not someone who's on his first gig or not someone who's, counting down the days until retirement. You want someone who's seasoned and experienced and has sound judgment. But again, we need to get to the facts about what happened in Uvalde, and it's something that we can incorporate into training lessons and plans. But again, as you saw there, training is only, and plans and procedures only as good as the people who are implementing them, and people make mistakes. And it's
now, Senator,
clear that some people made mistakes at Uvalde.
One of the things that stands out to me, and I asked Byron York about this, is that the officer in charge, the incident commander, was the chief of the Uvalde Police School Department, of which there are 6 members. I don't know when someone thought it was a good idea to stand up a 6-person police department, like Mayberry RFD, and I do not know why that happened. I suspect someone objected to the police being on the campus. I don't know. But it does seem to me that if the MAD approach, Mothers Against Drunk Driving approach, the federal funding for security at schools comes along, that it ought to be conditioned on having serious oversight of the officers in charge of school safety. A 6-person police department for schools is not a smart idea, and I think I can say that conclusively at the outset. It just doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, Hugh, that's a state-by-state decision. My understanding is that Texas it's more common to have school district-specific police departments. I'm not aware of many, really. I'm not aware of any, I don't think, in Arkansas. There may be some here and there. But in general, we rely on city police and county sheriffs. And it's been, good cooperative relationships between school districts on the one hand and city police and county sheriff's department on the other hand. Obviously, those are two different agencies, so there's got to be some agreements about lines of authority. But the most important thing to have is tactically sound and proficient officers on the scene. Again, we'll get to the bottom of this. There were, by reports I've seen, 19 officers present. And I'm confident that either the FBI or the Texas Department of Public Safety is doing a thorough after-action review and interviewing every one of those officers. So we'll know exactly what happened. But it appears obvious that they made serious mistakes in not neutralizing the shooter quickly. I mean, there may have been mistakes between the communications of the 911 dispatchers and the police on site as well, because it's clear that we have multiple calls from inside the classroom that children were still alive and the shooter was still present. I think at some point there were even a few shots fired that the police officers certainly would have heard since 911 dispatchers fired. And this is very common to what we learned in the Army, which is when you're under fire, especially, for instance, if you're under a sniper fire, then the first thing you have to do is neutralize the shooter. Even if your battle buddy to your right or left is shot, that means that by definition, you and everyone else is still within range of that shooter. So you have to neutralize the shooter even before you tend to the wounded or evacuate everyone else to safety. That was true what we learned in the Army. It's true whenever you have, a deranged shooter at a school or at a shopping market or anywhere else. The first step the police take has to be to neutralize the shooter.
Senator, I'd like to know your thoughts when the president starts talking about 9mm, which is, I think, 56% of handguns owned in the United States. I said on Fox News special report last night, that sets the conversation backwards. There is no appetite for a ban on handguns in the United States. None. Zero. What's your reaction to the president's ramblings about 9mm?
Well, Hugh, I think it shows that the president is confused about what happened, and he's just confused about firearms as well. This is a common feature I've seen in Washington over the years, is the people most enthusiastic about regulating guns know the least about guns. We had the nominee for the ATF last week ahead of us. This is a man who ran for Attorney General in Ohio and called for an assault weapons ban, and I asked him to define an assault weapon, and he couldn't do it. And the reason he couldn't do it, Hugh, is that there really is no such thing as an assault weapon. There's a rifle, there's a shotgun, there's a pistol of various calibers, but an assault weapon is a category of weapons. It's designed by mostly cosmetic features that are labeled by lawyers and lobbyists and politicians in Washington. Yet people still talk about that as if it is a definable category of weapons that could be regulated by law. Or they go out and talk about things like 9mm as opposed to 22 or 5.56 or 7.62. Some of them seem like not even know the difference between a rifle and a shotgun at various times. Before they start trying to infringe upon the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, you'd expect them to at least familiarize themselves with the most basic facts about firearms.
Now, I had a parent call earlier who pretty much spoke for me as a grandparent. And you're a young parent. I'm a young grandparent. We do not want our children growing up in schools that are target. And he asked me to urge every senator, and I will, to stay focused on protecting innocent children in schools. That does require the investigation you talked about, but I've seen so many comments that have immediately moved on to other things. Do you think the Senate working group can hold focus at least on a problem set that is defined and manageable, at least in a conversation? Because if it wanders all over the place, there won't even be a conclusion on the specific issue of children in fourth grade being protected.
It seems at least that's the focus right now, Hugh. And like I said, I think that would be a better focus and a sprawling debate about banning entire categories of firearms when most people talking about banning them don't even know what they really are, and support for that among the American people is quite low.
Now, Senator, with 2 minutes left, I want to switch to Ukraine. President Biden yesterday ruled out sending rockets that could hit Russia. That's another stupid comment because any rocket can hit Russia depending on where you are on the Ukraine border. And I go back to former President Trump used to say he didn't want to tell our enemies what we were going to do or not do. I kind of think that what used to be laughed at is now actually a pretty good response for this situation. What do you think?
Well, Hugh, they're continuing this foolish lawyerly distinction about offensive and defensive weapons. I mean, call me crazy, Hugh, but Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is defending its own territory. I think any weapon is inherently defensive. And Ukraine needs longer range artillery and rocket systems to make sure that it can reach the Russian troops that are on Ukrainian soil. But this is part of a pattern, you're right, going back to the fall of Joe Biden continuing to say what we will not do. He said we will never put troops into Ukraine. I don't think we should do that either. I don't think we should simplify Vladimir Putin's calculation by telling him that, though. In fact, it's so silly, Hugh, now that we have not yet put the U.S. Marines back at our embassy in Kyiv. Our diplomats are there. The office staff are there. Yet they won't put Marines to defend the embassy, as they do, Hugh, in downtown Moscow. Because Joe Biden announced we wouldn't have troops in Ukraine, and now you've got everybody in the White House chasing like a cat chasing their tail, figuring how they're going to let the Marines do their job to defend the front gates of the embassy while respecting the president's announcement that we're not going to put troops into Ukraine. I would contrast that to you with, say, what Ronald Reagan did in Afghanistan. In today's dollar, he spent billions supporting the Afghans fighting back against Russia when they invaded that country. But he almost never talked about it in public, and he certainly never ruled anything in or out, even though he never seriously considered putting troops into Afghanistan, because he never wanted to do anything that would simplify Russia's war planning then, the way Joe Biden continues to simplify Putin's planning now.
Well, and fully said. Senator Tom Cotton, thank you. The first of many senators I'll be talking to this week.